Hi, welcome to Twigsy, and this is an extended interview with Subhadra Das. I spoke with her recently about George Forrest and decolonialization while I was working on a video about him and the Nashi collectors. So that video ran a bit long, so this is cut out as an extended interview if you so choose to watch. It's a very fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
So my name is Subhadra Das. I'm a writer and historian, former museum curator, occasional comedian. I specialize in the history of science over the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I specialize in the history of race science and eugenics. So why wouldn't anyone want to talk about those absolutely fascinating things at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning?
It's a great topic at tea time with mixed company. So let's dive right into that. Scientific racism aren't scientists pure and angelic beings who don't fall prey to personal views and all that?
I wasn't sure where you were going to go with that question. I thought you were going to say, aren't scientists supposed to be racist? Um, well, I mean, the short answer to that question, Charles, is no. They are neither neutral nor objective. I expect the vast majority of them are in it in order to be able to further the greater good. I don't doubt their motives. I'm not going to decry their efforts. But what I would like is for them, scientists in particular, but actually for all of us, and particularly those of us who are not scientists, to just be a little bit more aware about where some of our ideas that we think of as objective, neutral for the greater good, where those things come from. So scientists are human beings, just like the rest of us. They live within a society. Their ideas that they work with are social constructs. And if they knew a little bit more, I think, about, first of all, where the ideas came from, but also the harm that those ideas have done, I think it would just be better for everyone concerned, really.
So it almost sounds like part of the problem isn't just what they say, it's what they don't say.
Very much so. Really well put, actually. For a lot of biologists and geneticists, who are the scientists who are sort of the direct inheritors of these ideas to do with race, this is old hat as far as their discipline is concerned. These are things that were dealt with and disproved in the middle of the 20th century. You know, we know the reason why we can say with such surety that race is a social construct is that it had been very clearly demonstrated to not be a scientific one. And so, in a way, I kind of get it because it's like they just know this stuff already. Why are we having to rehash this old nonsense? And the answer is because these ideas exist well beyond the bounds of science. They slipped the bounds of science a very long time ago. And unfortunately, um, I was just talking to a friend of mine who's working to avert the climate crisis. And her real frustration is people don't understand how immediate and how serious this is. The public conversation around the climate crisis is 20 years out of date. We're now acknowledging that it exists and that humans are the cause of it, but we're certainly not acknowledging how quickly and how devastatingly it is going to affect us, and it's going to affect us in our lifetimes, not our grandchildren, like we used to think. Um, but so it's this element of like this was supposed to be a dead and gone conversation, but the reason it keeps coming back is because I think ineffective science communication to a great degree, but also we do need to give credit to bad actors. Racists use good arguments. They use arguments that were good a long time ago.
Mm.
And so it's important, again, it's important we know where the ideas come from in order to demonstrate really why we shouldn't be having to think about them anymore. I don't
So
do this for, by the way, this is like not my idea of a good time. Okay. I could have been doing other stuff.
fair enough. So how does a botanist like George Forrest fit into this story? You know, going out to another country in the 1910s and 20s.
Hmm. Nominative determinism there, right? Who's just looking for more forests. Okay, how does he fit into it? Okay, so let's just say, for the sake of argument, that his science is neutral. How is George Forrest getting to these new places? What are the travel networks in place that enable him to get there? Where is the money coming from that he's able to fund his expeditions? Is he independently wealthy? In which case, where does his family money come from? If it's money from the government, where is the government getting the money from? And just how is he able to navigate the world in such a straightforward and simple way that we can think that all he's interested in is trees and plants? Those trees and plants, again, they don't exist in isolation either. So that's one aspect of it, is how is he able to move within the network of the world the way that it is set up? Going to his science, where is he getting his information from? It's not like he just rocks up in some nascent place that's completely isolated that no human being has ever set foot in before. He's probably got local agents, local colleagues whose knowledge and whose wisdom and actually whose action he's building his research on. They're going out and collecting things for him. They're, well, botanists, they're probably not risking their lives. Say he was a zoologist, they might have been if they were hunting. So it's that aspect. Again, he doesn't exist in isolation.
So are there other stories, well-known people that are examples of this hidden history where, yay, look what I discovered, and underneath that is a far more complicated story?
I mean, that's kind of all of them. Let's go with the big one first, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin tags along. His job was to make sure that the captain of the Beagle, who was a guy called Robert Fitzroy, did not lose his mind. Robert Fitzroy was concerned about the mental strain involved in his job. And so he needed someone who was a gentleman, because Robert Fitzroy is the captain of the ship. He can't talk to just anybody. He needed a gentleman companion. That sounds sexual to our ears. It wasn't that. So Charles Darwin tags along on this boat called the Beagle that's going around the world. He goes around the world. He looks at all of these amazing different animals. He kills lots of them, brings them back and taxidermies them and is studying them. And as the result of all of that effort, we have his theory of evolution by natural selection. Where is the politics and where is the empire as far as Darwin is concerned? Well, the Beagle is an army ship, Navy ship more accurately. Its job is to draw more accurate maps of the coast of South America. That's why he got to see Tierra del Fuego. That's why he got to see the Galapagos Islands. They were there looking to create better maps so that the British Empire could have a firmer foothold in that part of the world. Something that was carrying on into the 1980s as far as the Falklands were concerned. Darwin wouldn't have been able to do a lot of the work he did without all of those specimens that he collected. And he wouldn't have been able to preserve those specimens and know what to do to make sure that they lasted on the journey home with him if it hadn't been for a guy called John Edmonston, a freed Guyanese slave, formerly enslaved man, who taught Darwin taxidermy in Edinburgh when Darwin was a university student. So yeah, Darwin doesn't exist outside of the empire. We can even actually think about his theory of evolution and how his anti-slavery politics fitted into it, because what he was trying to demonstrate was that all humans were the same species, and therefore there was not a scientific argument for enslavement. We can talk about Alfred Russel Wallace, who's the co-discoverer of evolution, who probably wouldn't have been able to do half the things he did were it not for a guy called Ali, who was indispensable to him in his trips out in the Malaya Archipelago. I'm picking big names because those are easy names. But we can pick plenty of other ones. I really recommend. There's a brilliant book by the author and journalist Lulu Miller, which is called Why Fish Don't Exist, which is all about a guy called David Starr Jordan, who is actually, I think, one of the founding professors at Princeton, who was a eugenicist. Pick pretty much any leading scientific figure at the turn of the 20th century. There's going to be eugenics in there somewhere.
Yeah. So pulling it forward a little bit, what fixes the problem?
Which problem, Danny? What's the problem as you see it?
Yeah, okay. So what fixes the problem of both scientific racism today and correcting those stories of the past?
The correcting the stories of the past is a really easy one. There's plenty of historians who are doing it. They have a bit of a hard time because, as is definitely the case with you all across the pond as well, there are these notions of culture war, and about who gets to own and who gets to write history. All I will say to that is writing and rewriting history is what historians do for a living. So we can redress the balance of those stories. Another problem comes in, which is on account of the racism that is systemic that currently exists, finding audiences for and outlets for those stories is really difficult. So, I don't want to sound like I have a chip on my shoulder, apart from the fact that I really do. But the fact that I do this job for a living, I know that I've got a harder road to hoe than somebody who tells more typical science stories, those Whig science stories about neutral objective for the greater good scientists. So that bit is easy. How do we solve systemic racism? I feel like you don't want to be talking for the next 15 days. So the shortest kind of possible answer that I will give to you is the way that I see it is it would be good for, as I said, scientists to know the history of their ideas better. And for those of us who are not scientists to be much more scientifically literate than we are. Again, we need better science communication. And maybe actually, once we start to know this history a bit better, we can start to break down some of these fake divides between science and the humanities. Because again, as I've hopefully demonstrated, scientists are people. So yeah, to me, that's where the solution is, we've all got a lot more work to do. But I don't think it's difficult. We already do a lot of work. We already learn a lot of things. We already tell and read a lot of stories. We just need to get better at telling the real story.
So, speaking of telling stories, you co-wrote a paper almost 7 years ago with Miranda Lowe and talked about decolonialization. Can you maybe explain that for the viewer, what you mean by decolonialization in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you what I mean by it. Definitions will vary depending on who you talk to. The paper that Miranda and I wrote, Miranda Lowe is a principal curator of crustaceans of the Natural History Museum in London. I, at the time, was curator of the science collections at University College London. We wanted to draw attention to the fact that these sorts of stories have always been there. They've just not really gotten the attention they deserved within the natural history context. And our general position as curators was, this is kind of our job. We're missing out a huge chunk of what we're supposed to be telling people. So what we wanted to do in the paper in terms of talking about decoloniality is to say we want to acknowledge that this history exists. We want to reflect on what that means for the discipline of natural history today, the role and the nature of natural history museums, who works in them, what stories they're telling. And we want to be agents for positive change as a result. So that's that three-stage process that's kind of on the road to truth and reconciliation, right? Acknowledge, reflect, ideally change. So that's what we wanted to achieve. Decoloniality is about, again, acknowledge the colonial frame, reflect on how it could be different and how about ideally it's not serving us as well as it should. Therein we want to move on from where we are now.
After writing that paper, and you told me that that problem of correcting those stories of the past is the easiest part. So I bet the whole world of museum science and library science has changed since then, right?
Yeah, overnight. That was like really ineffective snapping. Let's try that again. No, it's just not, today is not happening. Well, in the defense of the Natural Science Collections Association, which is the journal that paper was published in and the conference at which we presented it, those folks jumped in with both feet, like respect to them. They really got it and they got on board. And, things are starting to shift. Possibly there is more talking about it than there is publishing about it, which I'm hoping is the publication rate will improve. But this thing is a bit of a behemoth, right? This thing takes a bit of effort to turn around. So what I would say to I guess they're my former colleagues now because I don't work in museums anymore. But what I would say to folks who are in the museums and in the heritage sector is be as unprofessional as possible. because, when I trained to go and work in museums, a lot of that is bedding into a colonial mindset. Museums were always tools of empire. That is what they were set up as. At a basic level, it's really easy to see that's where they kept all the loot, right? And that is where they told the stories about Western greatness and about white supremacy. The museum was a space in which all of that was happening. It was a space for objectifying and othering non-white people, for othering and objectifying queer people. It created a spectacle out of what should have been our common humanity. And so when I say be as unprofessional as possible, examine those aspects of your training and again, reflect on how well they're serving you in terms of the greater good.
Okay. So, what has improved?
I think it's easy to talk about these things now. I think people understand that it's a topic. The decolonial, we're not there yet, but acknowledging that the colonial was a thing is much easier now, I would suggest, in terms of the national conversation. The resistance to it is really loud and really stinky, but it's like a really small number of people, really dedicated bad actors. But by and large, more and more people are coming around to an understanding and an idea of how the world worked 150 years ago.
I mean, at this point, do we need to change minds or wait for a bunch of the old guard to die off?
There is a slightly nicer way of putting that would have been, yeah, one retirement party at a time. It's so interesting in terms of how much respect we give the old guard. I'm trying to remember who was talking. Someone earlier this week was mentioning to me about the nature of things only change when certain people die. And I think they were using the case of Darwin as an example, which is that Darwin was wrong about a whole bunch of stuff as well. Not the main thing. Evolution is, but those things that he was wrong about, people only felt safe in saying after he was gone. So I think what's required is actually a little bit of a greater honesty and a bit more bravery on all of our parts. It turns out, I didn't know this about myself, but it turns out I'm the kind of person who can't keep my mouth shut in that kind of situation, which is why, probably I would have more friends. But some things are more important than making friends. Truth and justice are important things in our world. So, yeah, sure, one retirement party, one funeral at a time. But no, I think let's be more honest about where it is that we all sit in this too.
So, is there anything that I haven't asked that viewers should know or take away and think about?
Well, I would love for them to read the paper. Because Miranda and I, that was blood, there was blood, toil, sweat, and tears that went into the writing that paper, which was very personal to us, as I'm sure you can appreciate, as two non-white people working in predominantly white institutions. The other thing that I would love for people to engage with is that I've written a book more recently than that paper. It's called Uncivilized: 10 Lies That Made the West, available from Barnes and Noble in the US, so you've got no excuse. Where I tell all of these stories in a bit more detail in terms of the history of race science, how these ideas came about, and more poignantly about how some people were deemed uncivilized, which made us think that they were backward people whose ideas weren't worth knowing. And that's definitely not the case. So hopefully there's a way to redress the balance of that altogether. Forgive the blatant self-promotion, but
Buy it now.
yes, please. But okay, give me a little bit of if you give me like a brief reader on George Forrest, like dates, times, work,
Yeah,
location.
so he was hired by the Royal Botanic Garden of Edinburgh, 1903,
Okay.
and sent as an explorer to Yunnan province. And I mean, he dovetails very well into what you're describing, that yes, he was funded by very rich white people and sent there. And much unlike the past, where it was one explorer who would go through a region, they were a priest and they would gather and send things home. He realized he was in a province that was mountainous and dangerous, and he hired local people. And there was a gentleman named Zhou Chengjiang who was mentioned by Forrest only in personal letters, once all of
Mm.
those boxes were sent back to the botanical garden,
Mhm.
isn't it interesting that none of them had any reference to any name but his own?
Yeah. Okay. I think that that's fascinating. I'm interested to learn more about him. I think his timing is interesting, and also particularly a Brit in China at that particular time period. To suggest that it's a powder keg is understating it. This is the space of the Opium Wars. And so politically, it's a very volatile scene. He's in the middle of here as well. But don't you think that's fascinating that I was able to tell you all about him without knowing anything about him?
There you
Um,
have it. So it's a pretty standard common story of the time, right?
I think so, yeah. I mean, everyone is different and everyone's kind of, their motivations vary, how they go about doing this vary. With some people, they name those local experts and agents that they work with and whose knowledge, that there's a knowledge exchange happening there. And it's only later on that we lose those names because the museum will only tend to remember the white guy, or, it follows the money.
Yeah.
And those are not where the money is.
Well, and so that's kind of funny because the where I dug into this was this book here, The Paper Road,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
in it, so I interviewed Eric Mugler who wrote this, and
Mhm.
when I got to the question of how did you find out his name, because Old Chow or something like that is what he was referenced to as kind of a dismissive name. And
Yeah.
he had gone to the Edinburgh Research Library or whatever, and
Yeah.
been there so many times that they finally just, okay, you just put on some gloves to make sure everything's safe. We're good. We got other stuff to do, and they left him alone.
Yeah.
And so
Hmm.
he dug through all of these documents and on his own found this guy's real name. And I think that's
Wow.
emblematic of the lack of effort of correcting stories going forward. But maybe.
Well, credit to him. That's a
Mhm.
proper historian. But the lack of effort there in terms of the archive. Now, I don't want to bitch about people in archives. They do a really good job and they work really hard but they have no money. And
Mm.
that's why, you know, like in the professional order of things, they were great because what they did was they were unprofessional. They let him get on with it. They let him have direct access to the archive himself, which meant that he was able to spend more time and could find it. They're overstretched. There's no money, and these are the systemic things that make this much more difficult to do. But credit to him. Wow, that's
Yeah.
a yeah, that's quite the achievement.
What made you say, peace out, I'm moving on and doing something else? Was it just the drive to write books or frustration?
I mean, not frustration so much as I'd been there a long time. And as time goes on, it just hurts a little bit more the more you're banging your head against a brick wall, right? The job of working in universities is banging your head against a brick wall. It's just over time it starts to become more tender. But yeah, it was primarily more the drive to take on a new challenge and do some new things.
Mhm.
And it turns out, I mean, I know loads of people who keep their day jobs and write books, and they are amazing. And I don't know how they do it. It turns out I'm not that kind of person.
I wrote one under duress.
They made you write a book.
And that was enough work. I'd do more, but man, there's not enough time in the day to do that and keep your day job.
Mm. Mm. And it was lovely to chat to you. Thanks
All
for
right.
your interest.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate all the attention. It's great. Thank you.